So, first things first, before I go on prattling about what I came here to talk about, I want to extend my sincere thanks to Deb, both for extending this opportunity to me and also just for the amazing work that she does with that she and the museum does. So I have not come out this way nearly as much as I would have liked, mostly because my time's been occupied the last few years, but it's really fantastic to have the chance to be here to talk with you guys tonight. Some of you I have probably crossed paths with on maybe Gypsy Blood or Independence 2. It's a little bit strange because I've been talking to so many knowledgeable New Jersey divers, dive shop folks, boat captains. I know a lot of people by name and by voice because I've talked to them on the phone or emailed them, but I've met some of these people and haven't recognized them. So if you are one of those folks, I apologize. I'll get to know you soon enough. So the purpose of what we're going to talk about tonight is a little bit different from what I have done up to this point. So this is the 6th presentation I've given kind of as part of my publicity tour, if you will, for this book. And the topics that I've talked about up to this point have generally been about the subject matter behind my book, which from the title and cover you can probably hazard a guess. And I've gotten overwhelmingly positive feedback on those presentations, but I got two requests from two different people. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a pattern. Two's a pattern. So what they said was they were fascinated by the content, they wanted to know more, but what they really want to know is how is the book written? How does this fascinating topic that you talked about come through in the book, and how is the story told? So that got me thinking that instead of doing a presentation on some topic or facet of this book, what I'm going to do instead tonight is something more akin to a story time hour. So what I'm going to do, instead of more of an academic type approach, is I am going to talk you guys through the story of chapters 7 and 8 from my book. Unlike most of the groups that I've addressed thus far, most of the people in this room are broadly familiar with some of the names that you see under part 2 up here. So I will really quick, Sorry. So this book I started writing in January of 2021. And I just put the signature on it last week, and I've been told it is at the printing press this week. So almost exactly 3 years. Yes, thank you. And there's a sort of things have come full circle tonight because the New Jersey Maritime Museum actually played a very important role in making this possible. And I haven't told Deb the story yet. I kind of teased it a little bit. But I'd kind of been tossing this idea around for a couple of years, and one day in January of 2021, I decided I was just going to do it. And one of the first things I did is I emailed the museum, which I had not been to, I didn't really know much about, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about writing the book about some ships that were sunk off Jersey during World War II. Do you have any archival documents, old photos, anything like that can get me started? And Dave Swope sent me, who I didn't know at the time, and I still have not met in person, sent me a link with a massive library of files that it formed the nucleus of my research library, which is now like a gorillion terabytes. So things have kind of come full circle in the sense that almost exactly 3 years later, this is at the printing press, and I'm here talking to you guys. So thank you very much to the museum, Deb and Dave, for that. So, on with the evening's programming. So, I will be talking to you guys, or I'll be telling you guys the story of chapters 7 and 8. I sort of see them as two halves to one story. As you guys will, some of you already know what I'm alluding to, but others of you will understand in a few minutes. So, a brief overview of how the book is structured. And I should say that my goal is talk for 45 minutes, tell a story for 45 minutes, and then open it up to questions. So part 1 and 3 kind of give a high-level overview of the how and why of this story. The final chapter, 17, covers the later lives of the book's characters, all of whom are real people. It talks about a little bit about the history of wreck diving and how that culture developed and how New Jersey was a center of that. But the meat of the story, the main story, is part 2, and it consists of 11 reconstructions of incidents that occurred along the New Jersey coast during World War II. All but one of them were in 1942. What I did was I used an extensive amount of primary sources to reconstruct these incidents, sort of like a novel, but there were no factual liberties taken. I didn't fudge anything, I didn't stretch anything. The only exception being a few points I had to kind of fill in the gaps where there's no historical record, like what were they talking about in the bridge at the moment the torpedo hit? I kind of had to, take a best guess at that. But this is a nonfiction story. One of my friends referred to it as a novel once, and he never made that mistake again. So a high-level timeline of the Second World War in the Atlantic European theater. Most of you are broadly familiar with these dates and some of these terms. I call your attention to the green bar on the second half of 1940. That was a period known to the German U-boat force as Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. So named because there was abundance of targets and a relative dearth of Allied forces to stop them. That was specifically in the North Atlantic. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, pulling the United States into the war. There had kind of been a general understanding in Germany and elsewhere that the US was probably going to enter the conflict eventually, but it wasn't clear when, where, or how. So the Pearl Harbor attack caught the Germans off guard as well. Obviously, they were not told in advance this was happening. So what happened was the admiral who commands the German U-boat fleet, Karl Dönitz, almost as soon as the Japanese planes have landed on their carriers off Oahu again, they're already planning Germany's first blow against the United States. And the first U-boat of the first wave, the well-known Operation Drumbeat, departed for North America on December 18th. So you could see the window of time and how crunched the planning was. Ultimately, between December 18th and 27th, there were 5 U-boats that left for North America. This kicked off a period known to the Germans as Die zweite glückliche Zeit, the second happy time. Once again, and as many of you are familiar with, there was an abundance of targets and not many enemy forces to stop the Germans. And the temporal setting of tonight's story is right about here. I had this drawing commissioned from a very talented artist down in Delaware named Bob Pratt. If anyone has ever read Ed Offley's The Burning Shore or a couple of Eric Weiberg's books, Bob also did the maps for those. So he did this one per my specifications. It's going to be published in my book, actually on one of the first pages. It gets almost a full page. But this is a representation of all the combat losses in the zone pictured. So in terms of New Jersey, which obviously this map covers a little bit more than that, but in terms of New Jersey, within boundaries that can be considered New Jersey waters, which I kind of subjectively defined, there were 28 vessels sunk. And that includes 1 US Navy vessel and 3 U-boats. And there's where we are. Our story begins on 26 February 1942. This is 44 days after the first German U-boats reached the East Coast. The intervening time, those 44 days, have consisted of an absolute massacre. There have been, in that time, 34 merchant ships sunk within 400 nautical miles of the US coast. The death toll stands at 739 for these sinkings. All of these fatalities were civilians, most of them merchant mariners, although 100 and change were civilian passengers aboard the City of Atlanta. So at the time of our story, on 26 February, this was about the lowest point of the low, and it would remain there for another 4 to 6 weeks, really 2 months, I guess. But this is a dark period, and there's a number of factors that have conspired to create this massacre along the eastern seaboard, one of which being that the Eastern Sea Frontier, which was the U.S. Navy command responsible for defense of the East Coast, simply did not have the combat resources necessary. Hardly any combat vessels, hardly any aircraft. It is fair to say that the American coast in general, and New Jersey in particular, was almost completely undefended at the time the Germans arrived. So that brings us up to the 26th of February. The situation's bad. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. One of the biggest shortfalls of the resources available to Eastern Sea Frontier is that they have no destroyers. There are destroyers and large cutters, 70 to 80 of them, available in the Atlantic Fleet for tasking. The admiral in charge of the United States Navy refused to allow any of those to be reassigned on any long-term basis to the East Coast. He simply wouldn't have it. If you've ever worked with somebody that just didn't do their job, that was Admiral King. So eventually these losses get bad enough within this 44-day period that it's agreed that a few destroyers will be assigned temporarily to the East Coast for a few days at a time while they're between convoy cycles out of Nova Scotia. So as a result of this, the East Coast, beginning in late January, gets a smattering of destroyers. They're on for a few days, they're off. It's really not ideal, but it's slightly better than nothing. Things begin to improve a little bit on the 19th of February when two destroyers are assigned to temporary duty at the East Coast, the USS Jacob Jones and the USS Dickerson. Enter the RP Resor, a wreck that many of you have probably been to. The Resor was one of the most advanced tankers in the world at the time. It was also one of the most well-known. The ship had been launched in 1936 and was purchased by Standard Oil of New Jersey. During its construction and launch, it was very heavily advertised within the international shipping industry, and it was so impressive, all of its bells and whistles and features, that it actually prompted a brief revival of tanker construction in the years immediately prior to World War II, which would, of course, those ships would prove very valuable. But the Resor was manned by a crew of 41 civilian merchant mariners, all Americans. Oftentimes these ships had crews of mixed nationalities, not this one. In addition to 41 merchant mariners, they also have a detachment of 9 US Navy armed guards. This is a Navy program that was first established during World War I. It had recently been resurrected in the months prior to our story. But due to general chaos of the United States entering the war and a shortage of guns, there were not enough of these detachments to put on every merchant ship yet, and there was also a shortage of guns. So the Resor was very fortunate in that she was one of the first ships to get an armed guard detachment. They had come aboard about 2 weeks earlier. But due to a shortage of guns, the Resor only had one gun mounted, and it was at the stern. There was a platform for a second gun on the forecastle, but there wasn't enough to allocate it, so that platform was empty. But that detachment consisted of 1 officer and 8 enlisted, and they brought the total complement of the ship up to 50. The night of 26 January, the RP Resor is making her way north on a voyage from Port Arthur, Texas, to Fall River, Massachusetts. In her cargo tanks are 104,000 barrels of Bunker C crude oil. This was used to power ships and locomotives. It's a very heavy oil. It's what you get after you distill out kerosene, gasoline, and things of that nature. It's almost like crude oil. So she's headed north. Late at night, the hour is approaching midnight, and enter John Forsdahl. One of the crewmen of the Resor, he was a Norwegian immigrant to the United States, lived in San Francisco with his wife and son. Forsdahl had been at sea for most of his entire adult life, and he had survived 2 U-boat attacks during the First World War. So this is not a guy that's a stranger necessarily to danger at sea. Is anyone getting feedback, by the way? Deb?
Yes.
Do you know we're getting feedback on this thing?
That's because you're too close.
Am I too close? All right, well then I'll have to get over here because I need to stay in camera frame. How's that? Better over here? Okay. So as the hour approaches midnight, John Forsdal is on lookout duty at the forecastle, which is the raised section of ship near the bridge, or near the bow. There are 3 other people on duty on his watch shift, but they are up here at the bridge, which is on top of the midship house, occupying the center part of the ship. We also have a 27-year-old from New York named Daniel Hay. Hay had joined the Navy immediately after Pearl Harbor. He is actually, despite only having been in the Navy for about 3 months, he was actually the ranking NCO of this 9-man detachment. Hay is asleep in the aft crew quarters, which is back right in front of the gun. This is where they were. This is their spatial reference of where they were relative to each other and relative to the rest of the ship. You'll notice the cargo tanks that comprise most of the ship's length. This is where the fuel oil was stored, and they had another tank for their own fuel. Forsdal's up here at the forecastle. Hay is asleep in the aft crew quarters. The RP Reeser, like all ships of her type, also had 4 lifeboats. There were 2 on either side of the midship house, 2 on either side of the aft deck house. Time is 23:26. Forsdal didn't even realize what had happened at first. He heard a blast louder than anything he'd ever heard in his life, so loud that it hurt. At the same moment, he feels the ship heave up under him and throw him into the air. It's almost as if the deck came up and attacked him from below. So Forsdal's standing on the forecastle, and suddenly he is deafened and tossed across the deck. He's by himself, there's no one else around him. He tumbles across the deck. 2-3 seconds have passed at this point, maybe 2 seconds. He lies there, he's stunned, his ears are ringing. He beginning to feel a heat washing over him. He's not sure where it's from, but he barely has a chance to get his bearings because almost as soon as this happens, he realizes that there is burning debris falling out of the sky, wood, metal, hitting the deck around him. He clambers under that empty gun platform up on the forecastle. It's not on this diagram. Huddles there for a few minutes while this nightmare squall abates, and then he climbs out from under the platform. Maybe 5, 6 seconds, 7 seconds have passed at this point. It's at this time that Forsdal lays eyes on something that seems to beggar belief. There is a 150-foot pillar of fire that has completely enveloped the midship house. There was 3 men inside and then a Navy sailor on lookout on top of the house. He stands in absolute disbelief of what he's seeing. His first thought, and he's now realized what is going on, of course, because he's seen this movie before, Forsdal tries to see past the fire to see if there's any way to get back to the aft lifeboats. It's also at this time that he can hear voices screaming from further aft. Quickly becomes apparent that there is no way past the flames. They have completely devoured the midship section, and worse yet, that fire is expanding forward and aft. Forsdal realizes that he is very quickly running out of room at the bow. The midship's lifeboats are engulfed in flames, and he is getting pushed farther and farther to the bow. Eventually, he ends up releasing a life raft that had he releases it, falls directly into the water, and then he happens to find a line leading over the port side hull, swings himself over the bulwark, and begins to, hand over hand, descend down. He reaches the water. Now, at the same time, rewinding a minute or two, at the same time that Forsdal is thrown across the deck when this explosion hits, Daniel Hay is awakened in the aft crew quarters. He feels the whole ship convulse, it jars him awake, and he wakes in full game mode because he knows that this is the full reason that there are armed guards assigned to these ships. Ideally, they would see a U-boat and engage before it attacked, but otherwise, the U.S. Navy doctrine is actually very explicit. It says the ship is to be defended with every means for as long as possible. So when he feels the ship convulse, he knows it's game time, gear up, get up on deck. But he has barely gotten up onto the deck when he realizes there's not going to be any shootout with the Germans. it is every man for himself. There's absolute chaos. Men are running, total panic. There's not going to be any defending of the ship. So Hay and two others try to get into the number 3 lifeboat on the starboard side. They find that it's full. That lifeboat was rated for 32 men, and it was completely full, no room for them. They go around to the other side of the aft deck house, to the number 4 lifeboat. And they realize then that they're out of time. That fire is accelerating, it is approaching them. All 4 men end up jumping off the side, which is about a 35 foot drop into the water. When they get to the water, they realize that that oil is hemorrhaging from the ruptured fuel tanks, or the ruptured cargo tanks, and the entire sea around the ship is on fire. Hay and the 3 other men find themselves completely surrounded by flames with no apparent way to escape. Forsdal had a little bit of a head start because he entered the water slightly earlier. He is at this point swimming out to sea as the fire is basically chasing him. It's not that the fire was that fast, it's that Forsdal was bogged down with oil. He's essentially swimming through molasses on top of his life jacket, on top of everything else he's wearing, on top of the water. He recalled something like in 20 minutes he moved like 100 feet or something like that. I mean, he's barely moving, but he's swimming out to sea trying to get away from this fire. Now, at the same time, there were Coast Guard watchstands along the coast that saw the fire in the distance almost immediately. I mean, a dark night, it was a relatively clear night, and you could see this fire clear as day. The first station to respond was Coast Guard Station Manasquan Inlet. There was only a handful, 5 or 6 men on duty at the time. The ranking Coast Guardsman, it was Chief Boatswain's Mate John Daisy, who is on the right in this picture there. Daisy immediately sends all his men into action. They only have enough to man 2 boats. Shark River Station also sends 2 boats. But Daisy grabs Thomas Evans and Oswald Etheridge, and they get into one of these 38-foot picket boats, and they are the first people en route to the scene. A few more boats from the coast follow them. There are more vessels that are going to converge by morning, but they're all quite far away at this point. So for right now, it is Daisy and his boys are really the only people that are coming to the rescue for the moment. So they, even at top speed, it takes them nearly an hour to reach the scene. It's easy to navigate because you just follow the giant sinister orange thing on the horizon. Now, John Daisy had about as interesting a career as you could possibly have in the Coast Guard. He'd worked the Great Lakes, he'd rescued flood victims in Pennsylvania, he had been in shootouts with Prohibition smugglers, he almost died responding to the Morro Castle cruise ship fire off Long Beach Island in 1933. So this guy has seen a little bit of everything, including ships on fire at sea. But after about an hour, when they get out to the scene, what Daisy sees, he, like John Forsdal an hour earlier, he can't quite get his head around. Now, there is no picture evidence of actually the burning ship from close up, but the verbiage in the first-hand reports from Daisy and from the Navy and Coast Guard is absolutely stunning, and it was a challenge for me to put it into words. So I'll tell you what I'm referring to. When they approach to the ship, of course, the whole tanker is engulfed in flames at this point. And the fire inside those cargo tanks is burning so hot that the hull of the ship is glowing white. Now, this ship is 435 feet long, about 60 feet wide abeam, and she's got, fully loaded, so she's got about 35 feet of freeboard, glowing white. There's so much heat coming off the ship that the paint on the picket boat was starting to blister. On top of this, you've got fumes in the air from burning smoke. It's an absolutely hellish environment. They're gagging, they're coughing, but they're in the oil slick by this point. But they do hear a voice calling out for help. They eventually find a man in the water. He's so covered in oil, they almost cannot, even the 3 of them almost can't get him aboard the picket boat. He's 3 or 4 times his normal weight, 300, 400 pounds or more. So they eventually finally get the 1 man aboard. By this point, a couple more, another hour's passed. There's a few more ships getting to converge. and they eventually go around the other side of the wreck and they find another survivor. But it's the way that the scene is described. One of the picket boats ends up getting stuck in the oil. It congealed around the screws, and they narrowly escaped as the flames are marching outward. The oil had now bled to about 500 yards around the ship, and that fire is still moving out. So it's an absolutely almost unfathomable scene. The local volunteer first aid department had set up along the beaches in North Jersey. They had set up emergency first aid centers, expecting to get this flood of wounded, burned men, but those facilities would not be needed because John Forsdahl and Daniel Hay were the only men out of 50 aboard the Resor that survived. These photos were taken at Manasquan Inlet Station the morning of. Reportedly, they were both grinning when they were brought off the picket boat. All the Coast Guardsmen had to trash their uniforms. They were too stained with oil. So this is now the morning of 27 February. The attack happened just before midnight. So that morning, the Resor burned throughout the night. She finally started to, the fire started to go down. As the morning went on, there are crowds of people crowding the beaches to see this behemoth funeral pyre just drifting. It's now, the tides are pulling it south. That is an actual, that clip I got off of YouTube, I credited it down there. That's actual footage of the Resor the morning after. You can see how the intense heat has buckled the hull and given it that flattened V shape. So people are now just watching this ship with smoke pouring out of it drift down the coast. So this is really the first time that anyone in New Jersey has seen something this stark in the light of day. Most people, anyway. The perpetrator was the U-578, one of the first Type 7C U-boats, one of the first Type 7 U-boats to operate along the American coast. The commander was Corvette and Capitan Ernst Rehwinkel. He was 40 years old, which was absolutely ancient by standards of the time. The average age aboard was about 22, 23, maybe a year older than that, but he's old by U-boat commander standards, and he has not sunk a ship until this evening, until the last evening. So the RP Resor was his first victory. In his log, he wrote about cheering and rejoicing in the boat, the crew, they finally got their first kill. Now, the U-578 had attacked from the surface, as U-boats in this era of the war usually did. And so the actual officer that sighted in the target and then gave the order to fire was the first watch officer, the second in command, Raymond Tiesler, 22 years old. So it was Tiesler that actually fired the killing blow. Enter the Jacob Jones, or as she was known to her crew, the Jakey. Jacob Jones was one of the two destroyers mentioned earlier that had just been assigned to the East Coast on temporary duty. She was an older ship, World War I vintage. She'd actually been launched just a few days after the armistice in 1918. Nonetheless, she's formidable enough. She's part of a class of ships called the Wicks class destroyers. There were three similar classes, the Wicks being one of them. They were known as flush deckers because they did not have a forecastle. They had this, it was just straight. They were also known as four pipers for these four smokestacks. This is pretty old, an old model by 1942, but this was actually, I believe the majority of the Navy's available destroyers at this time were flush deck four pipers. So that destroyer design, even though it wasn't ideal, they held the line for the first year in both the Atlantic and Pacific until more Fletcher classes and destroyer escorts could be built. So older ship, still has a lot of use, and she is actually not the first Jacob Jones. There was one before. That Jacob Jones was also a destroyer, DD-61, and she was sunk by a torpedo off southwestern England in December of 1917. So there's a little bit of an ominous prologue, but She's absolutely what the coast needs at this point, and she is now available for duty. The Resor was pretty respectably armed. She just had actually her armament increased, and she had one boiler removed in order to allow for more fuel storage space. So she was armed with 6 3-inch guns, 6 torpedo tubes, 21-inch, and about 60 Mark 7 depth charges. So that's exactly what's called for engaging enemy submarines. The layout of the ship, amidships, you've got the boiler rooms and engine rooms. There's an enlisted crew quarters near the stern. There's another enlisted quarters up front, as well as the officers and chiefs. And then there's a structure here between the second and third stack called the galley deck house. So pretty standard layout. There were 149, a crew of 149 Americans aboard. They were under the command of Lieutenant Commander Hugh Black. He went by Doobie as his nickname. Lieutenant Commander Black was a native of Oradell, New Jersey. He was 38 years old, a graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis, and he had 3 kids, the youngest of which was 10 months. Albert Oberg was one of the ship's radio operators. Ensign Norman Smith was the most junior officer aboard, 22 years old. He had just graduated from Annapolis a few weeks earlier, where he'd been captain of the baseball team. Paul Tidwell from Alabama, he was a fireman, worked down in the engine room. Lieutenant Benjamin Bronstein, the ship's doctor. And a gregarious and athletic young guy named Wilbur Dusty Rhodes from the town of Mercer, Pennsylvania. So by the morning of the 27th, which is also the morning that Jakey sets out on one of her first patrols along the East Coast, the burning tanker has kind of burned herself out by this point, and as mentioned earlier, she's now drifting south. So the Jakey leaves New York Harbor at about 1100, and her orders at this time are specifically to patrol the New Jersey coast. She's not going down to Delmarva or farther than that. This mission is a Jersey patrol. So she had just barely left New York Harbor when Eastern Sea Frontier radios Commander Black and says, hey, actually, we want you to do a joint patrol with the USS Dickerson. So they were tasked to do a joint patrol, and then they were supposed to split the patrol area among themselves. So they would patrol together for a while, then they would part ways. The Dickerson would take everything from Beach Haven north, and then the Jakey would get Beach Haven down to Cape May. So the 2 destroyers are heading south. They soon encounter the smoldering wreck that was once the RP Resor, again, just kind of drifting along. The 2 commanders talk amongst each other, and they agree that the Jakey will circle the wreck for a while and see if she could find any survivors, and the Dickerson's going to continue on. So the Jakey searches the area, no signs of life. By the time the sun is setting, there's a tugboat showing up for the wreck to tow the wreck away, and the Dickerson's long gone. So the Jakey resumes her patrol, headed south that night. She radioed once at 1956. She gets down past Cape May. Some point after midnight, she turns around and begins sailing north, bringing us into 28 February. And it's at this point, and the time just before dawn on the 28th, that the Jacob Jones encounters the U-578, the same boat that had torpedoed the RP Resor the night prior. Now, I need to specify that there was a reason that submarines in general, including U-boats, usually did not go out of their way to attack destroyers. They generally, 90% of the time, they're going to try to avoid a destroyer. Because I've never been big game hunting in Alaska, but if I was going to shoot a grizzly bear, I want to be real sure that I'm going to kill him right away, because if you just leave him pissed off, then you're in a really bad situation. And it's much the same with a submarine of this era. So generally speaking, they would avoid. Not only is a destroyer faster, more agile, much more heavily armed, but destroyers have a very shallow draft. So it's actually difficult to hit with a torpedo because you've got to set it to run very shallow. But Rehwinkel is feeling himself after getting his first kill the night before, especially one as spectacular and stunning as what befell the Resource. So he gives the order to move into attack position. Now, the tension on the German bridge, they're maneuvering on the surface, right? It's still dark, but the sun's going to be coming up soon. They're on the surface. They are well aware that they are one American lookout away from becoming the first U-boat lost in American waters. Boat maneuvers ahead into position, and Raymond Tiesler begins lining up his shot. The time is 04:55. Paul Tidwell has just ventured up from the engine room to the galley deckhouse to put sugar in his coffee. He does not realize that Tiesler has the galley deckhouse lined up in the reticle of his targeting optic. U-578 fires 2 torpedoes. The first hits directly under the bridge at 04:55. This ignites the magazine on the lowest deck, sparking a much larger explosion that shears off the entire front part of the ship. Lieutenant Commander Hugh Black, everyone on the bridge, and everyone in the berthing and forward part of the ship is killed instantly. 5 seconds after that, the second torpedo hits under the aft crew quarters. This blows away almost all the ship's structure above the keel plates, and Radioman Albert Oberg is the only man from the aft crew quarters that survives. It killed the sailor in the bunk above him. At this point, what is left of the Jakey slides to a halt. The Germans are already bugging out right now, but they're on the surface, so they're moving slow, and actually everyone on the U-578's bridge gets absolutely dusted with this pitch black cloud that's spewing from the front of the Jacob Jones. The surviving crew begin converging on deck. One of them, an engineering department sailor named George Pantal, he recalls being shocked when he gets up to the deck, wondering, where is everyone? He only sees about 30, 35 people on deck. He does not yet realize that those 2 torpedo strikes killed about 110 to 115 Americans in that 5-second span. It is at this point that Dusty Rhodes, who's probably one of the most senior people left alive at this point, he actually takes charge of the effort to abandon ship. Organizes an effort to get the lifeboats launched, but they discover that the davits are damaged and there's too much oil on the deck. They can't get enough traction to launch these boats. So Dusty Rhodes says, screw it, go for the life rafts instead. So they start cutting life rafts and getting them in the water. And it's at this point they start bringing people, trying to get people off the deck into the rafts. The ship, the truncated ship, is still afloat at this point, but she is taking on water. She'll end up going down after about an hour, but she's staying mostly upright. And it's at this point that a figure staggers out onto deck and collapses. The figure's so horrifically injured, it's difficult to tell who it is at first. Young guy, he's got blood coming out of every part of his face. His eyes look almost black from the capillaries being burst. His eardrums are ruptured. He's got flash burns all over his skin. It is 22-year-old Norman Smith. He's the only officer to survive the torpedo strikes. The survivors' reports describe him as completely incoherent at all times. So they lower him down onto one of the rafts. At this point, Smith is screaming in agony, sort of this grim soundtrack over this evacuation. So eventually they get most of the people off the ship. Dusty Rhodes was not among them. He was last seen still leading the evacuation in the last seconds when the ship went down. But they do get most of the people into the water. There's 3 rafts and about 30 to 35 survivors. Some of them are on the rafts, some of them are clinging to the rafts, some of them are swimming too. One of the rafts has about 12 people on it, so that's the most crowded one. They watch the Jakey go down over what was her bow and disappear beneath the surface. The ship's gone. But it's at this point that the survivors' experience takes a turn for the worse. because as the Jacob Jones is sinking beneath them, their depth charges start to go off. Each one of these Mark 7 depth charges has a main charge of 400 pounds of TNT. And as I'm willing to bet most of the people here in this room are aware of, the physical properties of water, namely its elasticity, transmit blast energy much more efficiently than air does. And these things are exploding directly beneath the survivors. Everyone on the crowded raft is killed. Ensign Smith is killed. George Pantal is actually clinging to the crowded raft. He ends up getting launched airborne, but he survives without serious injuries. It's just one blast going off after another in this cascade. And by the time the sea grows quiet again, there were a lot fewer than 35 men alive. And those that did survive that day remembered people just, their strength running out and just rolling off the raft, people just kind of dying in real time. And they were actually sighted by an aircraft very shortly after this, and then the ones left alive were picked up later in the morning by the Eagle 56, another old World War I vintage ship, and the Eagle 56 rushes the survivors back to Cape May. One of them dies en route. So out of the 149 men that had left New York Harbor aboard the Jacob Jones the previous morning, 11 returned to Cape May alive. The 12th died aboard the Eagle 56 on the way there. Fast forward a few decades, in 2011, Paul Tidwell's grandson decided that he wanted to do something special while his grandfather was still alive. And he was a certified diver, but he wasn't necessarily as experienced as you. He was more kind of my level of experience. And he came to Cape May and dove the wreck of the Jacob Jones, which is, as most people in here will know, not a frequently dive wreck. But it was kind of a Tidwell family reunion ashore. They met at the observation tower over on the other side of the peninsula, and there was some media that showed up. Paul Tidwell himself was there in a wheelchair. It's actually the first time he had returned to New Jersey since the events of that day. His son said that the cold water was just something, it permanently turned him off from anything remotely cold ever again, and he lived the rest of his life in Florida after he retired from the Navy as a chief. And that's Eric Tidwell on the left. He was a naval flight officer at the time. He was about to PCS to Japan. And that is Paul Tidwell. He died in 2013. And Eric and Eric's father were one of the many sources that I interviewed for this book in order to kind of get a sense of who his father was and what he was like. And that is what is left of the Jacob Jones today. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my song and dance. I thank you tremendously for your time and attention. Thank you. So I will now take questions until Deb cuts me off.
All right, my name is Mark Allen, and I'm from Cape May, New Jersey, and I came up to hear Kyle's presentation. I'm glad I made the trip. In the summertime, during our season in Cape May, I actually work in the fire control tower where Mr. Tidwell.
Did you meet him?
Yeah, I did not meet him. That was 2011. That's before I started working at the tower. But I do give a presentation at the tower. And one thing I want to share with you, and this is important, Kyle, and this is why I really appreciate your presentation tonight. I'm always amazed when I'm up on top of the tower. A big part of my presentation is the Jacob Jones, because it's right off the beach. And we talk about the Jacob Jones, but I'm always amazed by people who they look at me and they say, were the Germans really that close? And they were, you know? And were they really that proficient in sinking ships off our beach? Yes, they were. And was the water really that cold? And yes, it was. So it's you'd be amazed how history has been lost. So that's why your book, your story, is so important. I appreciate it. And you're welcome to come down to Cape May, because I think the fire control tower, you'd find it very interesting. We have a nice presentation. We have a model of the Jacob Jones. We have some photographs when Mr. Tidwell was back to visit and his son. So, but thank you very, very much, and thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you very much. So it's funny you should mention, people being surprised about the facts of this story. That was the genesis of this book. I say in the prologue that the genesis was my dives in some of these wrecks, like the Tolton and the Gulf Trade, which is true, that's part of it. But just as big a part was the fact that I'd be mentioning this topic in passing. So I was like, oh, what'd you do this way? Oh, I went diving. Oh, what'd you dive? It was this ship that got torpedoed. Wait, what? Wait, yeah. So I had that exchange, umpteen times, and eventually I decided, like, I want to actually tell this story instead of rehashing the same soundbite every time someone asked what I did on Saturday. So that was the genesis of the story, and I'm interested in seeing that model of the Jakey, by the way. But what really captivated me about this particular story is there is no shortage of horrific incidents that occurred along the coast during that era. But for some reason, this is one of the worst, and yet seems to me to be one of the most forgotten. I didn't know, I had a good working knowledge of this topic when I started this, but I had never heard of a destroyer with almost the entire crew dying right off Cape May. I mean, that's probably the single most dramatic event that occurred in 1942 along the coast, I think, and it seems to be one of the most forgotten of all of these. So I'm not sure why, but that compelled me to put an extra effort into Chapter 8. It's one of my favorite chapters, but I guess they're all my favorites. So, sir.
Yeah, you said I think.
We're passing around the microphone, so.
Got it. You said earlier in your presentation the number of ships that were sunk off the Jersey coast. I didn't get the number. Could you?
28.
28. Okay.
And that's within what I defined, and it's not on the map. I built a Google Earth overlay. I should add it to the presentation, but I drew some lines and said, okay, I'm going to call this New Jersey waters.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
My question's more logistically with the German U-boats. How many were off the coast of Jersey, and how did they get fuel? What did they eat?
Sure. Great
how
question.
were they able to survive so far away from home?
No, that's an excellent question. So, your question of how many operated off Jersey, I could get you an answer. My battery's dying, but I'm done. So, I could get you an answer for that. It would probably require about 45 minutes of legwork on it, but that's how accessible that information is. If I had to take a guess and say the number of boats who patrolled through, we'll say within 200 nautical miles of Jersey, a few dozen. It's maybe 25, 30-ish.
And did they make it back to Germany?
Most of them. Most of them left from French ports. It's a more direct route, shorter route. So your question about food and fuel. So they had enough fuel, both the Type 7 medium boats and the Type 9 large boats. They had enough fuel to come here, operate for a couple of weeks-ish, and then return back. So that was within their means. The food, they were limited to what they could take. So when a U-boat left port, they had every square inch of the boat packed with provisions. So you've got sausages hanging between torpedoes, you've got potatoes stuffed into cabinets. Yeah. And in fact, if you watch Das Boot, you can see some of that. But they would literally pack every square inch, and you don't bring a bag aboard. There's no personal gear. You bring, I think most of them brought 2 pairs of underwear, one for the way out and one for the way back. So that is how you were living. Now, in exchange for this, you might wonder who would sign up for that. They also had the best quality food, both in port and at sea. At sea it all tasted like diesel, but best quality food. They got extra allowances. When they were in port, they probably lived better than anyone in the Wehrmacht, especially the junior enlisted guys. So they highly incentivized this because you had to put up with that stuff out there. Now, I mentioned this in the book in passing, talk about fuel. They had enough to get to the East Coast, as far south as Florida, and operate pretty effectively. They did not have enough to get to the Gulf of Mexico. But in April, the Germans deployed their new Type 14 resupply U-boats. So they didn't have any torpedo tubes. They had food, doctors, technicians, and fuel. Most importantly, fuel. So they could rendezvous with a U-boat, say near Bermuda, top off their fuel, and then that boat could go patrol through the as far as the Mexican coast in the Gulf of Mexico. So that they needed that in order to get down to the Gulf, but not the East Coast. They had enough.
Thank you.
Sir.
Just an anecdote. There's an interesting story about a famous U-boat sunk off of North Carolina called the U-352.
Yep, I've dived that.
Yeah, it's a great dive.
Oh yeah.
It was sunk by the Coast Guard cutter Icarus.
Mm-hmm.
And the fellow who discovered it was a dive boat operator called George Purifoy. And I'm sorry. Okay. So the U-boat was discovered by George Purifoy, and when he first dove it, he went inside, and inside the pressure hull, there was a layer of oil, and preserved in the oil film inside the pressure hull, he peeled off these bread wrappers, and the bread wrappers were from a bakery in Morehead City. Mm-hmm. So the sub was being resupplied by sympathizers from the States.
That I've heard that story reported about a few different U-boats about finding the bread wrappings. There's no historical basis for that. Unfortunately, that was something that was a major concern. And another thing the Navy was concerned about is they were convinced there were neutral merchant ships refueling the U-boats because how were they getting over here and operating? There were none. That they were convinced that a lot of these destroyers spent their time chasing down suspicious merchant ships, especially if they were Spanish or Swedish or some other neutral country. The Germans weren't. They were using those not on the East Coast. And they were mostly sunk by 1942. So there have been ample legends throughout the years about U-boat sailors came aboard and went to dance halls and movies, and none of that did happen. But part of the reason that I wanted to write this book is that the truth is really shocking enough, and it really beggars belief. But the U-352 is an amazing wreck, and they've got those the artifacts in the display case at was that Olympus Dive Center. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you a very funny story about the U-352. I wanted to dive this wreck for years. I was living out in California for a few years where I did like my dive master and everything, and this was like I wanted to dive the U-352 more than anything in the world. So my first time going to North Carolina, this is right before COVID, I'm the only person on the boat that really wants to go to the U-boat, and I ended up on a boat with all strangers because we had an admin mix-up, and nobody else, they've all seen the U-boat, they're over it, they want to do like the spar or whatever. And I'm literally going around to each individual person like, what do I need to do? I have to get to the U-boat, please. Eventually I cajoled like a critical majority, and the captain's like, all right, we'll do the U-boat. So we get to the I'm the first one in the water, just gone. I'm the first one back out, and the dive master goes, are you happy now? I said, yes, yep, that was all I needed. I did do it one more time after that, but yeah, it's a great ride.
But just one comment to the gentleman over there who, and I think you said about the Jacob Jones being kind of forgotten in history. I think from a diver's standpoint, the reason for that, like the Resor, we dive a lot, is dove a lot. There's a lot of wreckage there. The Resor is massive. The deck gun is still there, canted over. Paul's got a nice picture of it right here. But the Jacob Jones was so demolished by the torpedoing, by the depth charges going off, that there's very little.
Yeah.
And what little there is so scattered and buried that from a wreck diver standpoint, it's rarely visited because there's just not a lot left to find.
Yeah, that does make sense. Sir?
It wasn't publicized. They kept all that information under the cover, right? They didn't want the enemy to know that they had this success, so no one spoke about it.
Yeah, I mean, yes. And also remember the time frame. Remember, you've got 30,000 Americans that are about to fall into Japanese captivity in the Philippines. You've got just all manner of stuff getting pulled in all different directions. So digging into the newspapers for this, you see it in the papers. The Jacob Jones was reported on for a few days, and then it's just, the Philippines, Corregidor, the Eastern Front. I mean, there's just so much going on. It just kind of gets swallowed up. And part of the reason that I wanted to write the story is that there are so many stories like that of ships, of individuals, that they're caught up in the enormity of this global tragedy, and individual stories just kind of disappear into the fog. And I thought, well, you know, I can't tell them all, but I can pick a few relevant ones and kind of bring them back to life. So one of the things that I'm most proud about of this book is that most of these stories, in fact, of those of the 11 main chapters, only one of them has really been written about in detail, and that's Pan, Pennsylvania. And I'm not sure if anyone read Randall Peffer's book, The Hunt for the Last Where Divers Dare, The Hunt for the Last U-Boat. Fantastic book. I used that as a basis for my version because I wanted to tell a distinct version of the story, but that book was excellent too. But other than that, most of these really haven't been, no pun intended, deeply researched and told. So I hope somebody comes along and does it even better than I did. I'll let you guys be the judge how well I did it in a few weeks. You can tell me. Some of my cards were floating around here. If anyone didn't get one and wants one, I've got extras. It's got my my website on there. If you want to get a hold of me, there's a portal. You can email me directly through the website, or if you want to follow me on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days.
The other side of the story also is, if I got my numbers correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, around 30,000 German mariners went to sea in submarines. Okay? 20,000 never came home.
Broadly accurate, yeah.
All right. So that's something we don't often think about, but just, you know, what the price that the Germans paid for
Yeah.
for what was going on. And
I
I thank you again. I really do.
thank you.
I'm looking forward to having you on the program.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it too. If that interests you, I got another statistic for you. Two numbers. I see if we can take some guesses on this. So the number of U-boats sunk by combat action within 400 nautical miles of the U.S. So that not scuttled after the war, but sunk in combat. And how many Germans died in those sinkings of those U-boats? Does anyone know? Can you take a guess how many U-boats were sunk within 400 nautical miles? It's not. No, it's not.
20?
20, I hear. What, we got anything else? 12? 14. It's 14, so you're close. Anyone want to take a stab how many Germans died on those 14 boats? 500, I hear. I feel like an auctioneer up here. 500. Crew, you're looking at about 48. Yeah.
48 times 14.
Oh, you've hit my critical weakness, math. It's 665 is the number of fatalities. So one thing I realized in doing research for this is that there are really not many reliable statistics about this topic. And those statistics that do get published, if you dig into it a little bit, they're mostly just being repeated from a number from a Navy communique during the war that were all wildly inaccurate, obviously. So I noticed that there was a real dearth of accurate statistical info. So I spent quite a few months collating data onto several Excel spreadsheets in order to come up with some of these numbers. It was really tedious, and I'm never going to do it again. But that was definitely a gap, and I said, I don't think anyone's tabulated this stuff, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm still good. My intent is to somehow put that statistical data out. I'm just not sure in what form I'm going to publish it yet, so stay tuned.
Back in the 60s, I worked with a fellow that was a submariner, German submariner, that got captured during World War II, and they sent him to Texas, POW came to Texas. And he was telling me that he was pretty well treated there, and that he didn't smoke, and they gave him a allotment of cigarettes, and they used to sell them to the guards.
Oh yeah,
You know.
that's another. It's actually something I've contemplated maybe doing a future writing thing about. But another untold story is the fact that there were like 500,000 German POWs in the U.S. by the end of the war. I mean, it was unbelievable. And these guys, probably the best fate that could befall you in any fighting force in World War II was to be a German that ended up in a U.S. POW camp, because they literally took courses that counted for college credit when they got back to West Germany. Like they had theater troops. It was nuts. And that's a whole topic in and of itself, but it's fascinating. Do you remember what boat he was on? your friend?
I don't recall. I don't even know if he ever told me, to be honest with you.
Anything else? Also, before I terminate I've talked a lot tonight, I know. It came to my attention just before I started speaking that we do have a merchant marine veteran from World War II in the house. If we could all just give him a round of applause. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir.
I would like to say, I was in the Battle of Bulge, and we brought back German U-boat commanders and crews that surrendered. We brought 28 of them back to the Keys.
Wow, yeah.
And
Yeah.
they were brought back to give information on warfare. you know.
Yeah. Well, fascinating.
I hope we learn something from the next war.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't from War One.
Yeah.
And then in World War II, we made the same mistakes as we made before in the last war.
So one of the most mind-blowing things that I ever learned about the American way of war is that if you think about it, the U.S. enters every war not prepared. It's always the first 6 months, 12 months is like just chaos and oftentimes with significant human cost. But we always figure it out at some point. At least we used to.
Can't fight until you piss us off.
Yeah. Well, I'll hold further comments, but yeah, no, noted. Anything else? Sure. I think am I being played off the stage? Okay. Great. I'm out of answers anyway, so.